everyone, and thank you so much. Good evening, and good afternoon, and good morning. If you're in Asia, that's very late night. So thanks for joining us here. I'm very thrilled to be part of the EU COP site events and having a panel here talking about climate action, climate responsibility, and carbon credits. And this is the time where we've seen so many countries and companies pledge net zero, also cities, by the way. And one of the key things is thinking about what exactly does net zero mean? What do we look at when we see ambition? What is it we look at in terms of ensuring companies are accountable to their own carbon footprint? And then how do we ensure that whatever financing they do actually is clear in terms of carbon credits, and what does good quality mean? Ultimately, what we want to know is, what does good look like? In terms of ambition and credibility, how do we ensure that we can all understand what it looks like, and how do we actually meet the Paris goals, either as a country or as a company or as a city? So I'm very thrilled to have our panel here, but I'd like opening remarks from Frank Wolke, Frank and I have worked for 3 years on really trying to understand this from a carbon market perspective, and he's with the German Environmental Agency. And Frank, I'm just going to let you go.
Yes, okay, so thank you, Maria, and dear ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the German Environment Agency, I cordially welcome you to this side event about what Maria said: climate responsibility, climate action, and carbon credits. Till the end of 2020, we had market instruments elaborated under the Kyoto Protocol, and probably all of you know this. They have been used to a significant extent, but also there is concern about implementation and also environmental integrity aspects. So the Paris Agreement has set a new system of market instruments with the corporate approaches under Article 6, and the accompanying Paris decision also referred to the experiences gained and the lessons learned from the former instruments that have been developed under the Kyoto Protocol, mainly the CDM and the GI. So in consequence, it is quite clear after the Paris Agreement that there cannot be a one-to-one transformation of the former rules, modalities, procedures, and the methodologies that we had under the Kyoto Protocol and the CDM. We see in the current negotiation text for Article 6 proposals that any new approach for markets has to align with the NDCs of the host countries, and that's challenging. So under these circumstances, it has to be identified what role the carbon crediting can play in achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And one aspect is the question: which sectors and which activities may require assistance through carbon crediting, and how the company's climate action towards a climate neutrality should be transparently communicated in the future. So with regard to these issues, the German Environment Agency has conducted a research activity that Maria just mentioned about the suitability and the success factors for offsets post-2020. And you will hear main results from this project from our research partners. And they are to be published shortly, hopefully. And building on this, I'm also happy to have distinguished speakers here to discuss the aspects of it and how to raise the ambition with offsets in the future. So we hope that this side event will shed a light on possibilities, but also on the challenges for future offset approaches. I thank our research partners, the Wuppertal Institute, South Pole, and also my colleague Friederike Erxleben, who has organized the workshop and has organized also the research activities. And I thank you all for contributing to this event. And I hope that we will have a fruitful debate in the next hour. And that's from my side. And with this, I hand over to you, Maria, to continue. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Frank. So one of the key things that we really understand is actually understanding the transparency part of global climate action and really understanding what is the carbon footprint. And so I'm very thrilled to have Daniele Pernigotti. He is the CEO of Equilibria and also works with the Carbon Footprinting Network of Operators. And Daniele, please help us explain why carbon footprinting, what's its necessary, and how does it enable credibility in climate action?
Thank you, Maria. Yes, if you want to speak on carbon credit, we need to start from MRV, from the company perspective. If you may have the slide, please. And the purpose of my intervention is to give more clarity on the quantification and on communication connection with the carbon footprint. So I have a large experience on ISO standardization. I was the convener of the working group that developed the ISO 14067. And the first aspects that we need to underline is that when we mention carbon footprinting, we need to have on mind two different directions. One is for product and the other one is for organization. And for this reason, ISO developed two different standards, ISO 14067 and ISO 14064 Part 1. And there are also additional standards for the verification and accreditation part, because we know MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification, we may also add accreditation, because this is fundamental to give credibility on the quantification side. And there is a verification system, accreditation system that are part of the multilateral agreement that is a group of accreditation body associated together in the International Accreditation Forum. This is fundamental because this implies that the same quantification performed in Italy, for example, is acceptable in Portugal, is acceptable in the US and Australia, and so on. And as you mentioned before, Carbon Footprint Italy is part of an international network, it's Carbon Footprint International. You may see here some of the programs that are part of this network. I don't want to mention all the numbers that are on the table, obviously, but only like to underline the countries that are part of this network. Costa Rica, France, Italy, New Zealand, Peru, Taiwan, Thailand, and USA. And you may also see the different year foundation, because the first program started far away in 2006. We are the most recent one, is 2018. You may note that some program is working only on the product sector, in the organization sector, or in both. So why a program operator are important? This is an interesting research study carried out under the Padua University, recognizing that the work of program operator is well recognized by the public sector, and also the importance to have the combination of private and public sector to have an effective action. And finally, that the carbon label is an important tool in direction of the consumer interest. And here are some more extended representation of the program operator working together. In this moment, this kind of network is only the first step of collaboration. We only share minimum information, minimum knowledge at the moment, but I will show you later something more on what could be the next step in this direction. And now I go a little bit more in detail in our Italian program, Carbon Footprint Italy. And we work only on the communication side, because after the quantification, we have reliable data, verified, under accreditation, everything is okay, we have the number. Then the problem is how to communicate the number, how to give credibility on the number, because there is also the risk to be recognized in the greenwashing with the self-declaration, for example. So these are the most important aspects in connection with the program operator on carbon footprint. We work in four main areas: the quantification of product, carbon footprint of product, of organization. Carbon reduction is another very important aspect to show the performance tracking in connection with the product, for example, and then carbon neutrality. Each of these labels has a QR code. A QR code is fundamental because it's the way to connect the label with the background information. Here we have an example of a product, for example. You may see the name of the company, the contact reference of the person, and the description of the product. But what is also important is all the background information on the study. What has been verified, and the number supported the carbon footprint with the differentiation between upstream and downstream, for example. And we signed the first memorandum of understanding with the Climate Registry, that is a program based in California, but is operating in the West USA and West Canada. And this is another, in my view, very important aspects. This is in connection with another standard. Sorry, I need to mention a lot of numbers today. Is 40,029. Is still under development. Is in the final stage of the before the publication. But in my view, is very fundamental standard because it go in direction of the mutual recognition between program operators. Before I mentioned the MLA, multilateral agreement between accreditation body. And this is the part of cooperation of the control system for the quantification. Now we move to the cooperation between program operators that want to communicate in a consistent way through different countries. Because as you see before, we have different labels, different mark describing the activity of each program. And the 14,029 required as a first step a memorandum of understanding, and then there are other upper level arriving to the final full consistency that require the cross peer evaluation between program operators. So we are still on the first step, and here I mentioned the first memorandum of understanding between Carbon Footprint Italy and the Climate Registry, but tomorrow will be an extension of this agreement, including the New Zealand program operator, TOI2, as well as the program managed by the Ministry of Costa Rica, the Carbon Neutrality Program. And so is, I believe, an important point in the direction of the multilateral recognition. And I also take the opportunity to present another couple slides because we don't have enough chair on the podium, and so I like to thank Alexei that is here present of EverCity. EverCity as well as Equilibria are part of Climate Change Coalition. A Climate Change Coalition is a very interesting initiative in my view, including 260 members from 50 countries that want to use blockchain and digital solution to mobilize climate finance and enhance MRV. So in a way, we want to share experience, want to share technology to create a still more trustable, still more reliable system in terms of MRV. And the collaboration between EverCity and Carbon Footprint Italy was to develop the blockchain application within our registry. And maybe in the question and answer time, we may ask Alexei to give more technical details on what is behind this technology. But the idea is to have the decentralized blockchain application to store information. Because if we want to move from the MRV in direction of mitigation, the reduction of emission or carbon neutrality, we need to have the very reliable information, not only for the present quantification, but even the past. Because the baseline, the starting point is fundamental when you have the path of reduction. So to have this information connected with the blockchain technology means that all the information in the past are unmodifiable. So you may really better track what is the reduction path in this direction. And also there is two new activities under development on carbon neutrality and carbon reduction that will be connected with the blockchain technology. So to go in the conclusion, I want to underline three main aspects to give credibility on monitor reporting and verification. First of all, for sure, reliability on quantification. We know there are a proliferation of standards at the sectoral level, geographical level, but what is important, in my view, is to have a standard that are internationally recognized. And this is the reason because I strongly support the use of ISO standard, because it's a standard produced by different countries, is applied in different countries. Then the quantification is the first step, the second step is the communication. And to have a reliable communication, you need to move from the self-declaration to the program operator that may give a guarantee to the market. And finally, the international recognition of communication, because it's the only way to move from a national domain to the international activities. Thank you. I'm here available for the question.
Oh. Grazie, Daniele. That is incredibly important in terms of one of the hardest things for consumers or investors or anyone is to actually understand what is the climate impact of product services companies. And since companies don't work most companies, well, I would love to know the number, but we do know that companies work across borders, they sell across borders, and to be able to have that kind of standardization is so incredibly important. And also in the communication bit, because that's where a lot of these debates are in terms of standardizing transparency. But traditionally, carbon crediting or MRV systems really has been thought of not just in terms of countries figuring out how much emissions are coming from their sectors, but really where we've seen a lot of strides in the past is through offsets or carbon credits. And so I want to invite my co-author, who we worked on a 3-year program as well, on looking really at the role, what can we learn from the past and what can we think about the future in terms of ensuring that offsets are future-proof, that it really drives finance towards those sectors that are suitable. So Nico Kleibig from Wuppertal Institute, if we can beam him in, and there we go.
Yes,
Nico, take it away here.
Thank you. Yeah, I will now, I'm very happy to present findings from the research project Maria just mentioned. There's an Uber-sponsored project on the potentials for offset approaches in selected sectors. And I will now present findings from one part of the project, the part which was led by Maria. So I'm very happy to do this on her behalf. Yeah, on the next slide, you see the starting point. Next slide, please, of our activity. Yeah, thanks. So what we did, we explored the future role of offsets. So it's about offsets under the Paris Agreement and post-2020 circumstances. And we always looked at both sides. We looked at the demand side and the supply side. And the key question was, we asked was, who is eligible? Who should be eligible to buy offsets on the demand side? And here we found that it should be those sectors that have hard to abate emissions, that are truly unavoidable. And we think that this was the main rationale behind this is that they should be eligible for using offsets as a cost containment measure to avoid adverse economic effects. So on the supply side, we also asked the question, who should be eligible, which activities should be eligible to generate offsets? And here we use the concept of inaccessibility of mitigation activities. So it should be those mitigation activities that are currently inaccessible due to technological, financial, or other barriers that should be allowed to generate offsets, and who could also benefit from carbon crediting. So it should really be ensured that carbon finance can help these activities realize also sustainable development benefits. And as you might know, this the concept of inaccessibility is also has been elaborated by Carsten Warnecke, is also here today. So I'm happy to build on his concept and further elaborate on this. On the next slide, you see how we applied this concept to the supply side. We have developed a framework to identify inaccessible emissions that could realize SDGs. So we have identified different factors that are relevant for that could indicate the suitability of sectors for generating offsets. So this includes some of them are policy related, others are related to the actors' abatement capacities, some are technical, economic, and some are related to the environmental and social aspects. So I will not go into detail in all of them, but highlight just some of them because in particular the technical, economic, and environmental and social are better suitable to be assessed at the global level, while policy-related factors and actors' abatement capacities are clearly linked to the circumstances in individual jurisdictions. So what we did, we found an optimal level for each of these factors. For instance, on the technical maturity and market penetration of technologies, we found that this should be medium because you want a certain level of maturity and market penetration of a technology. You don't want the technology to be nascent and really at the beginning of the transformational change process, but rather, you would like the technology to have a certain level of maturity. At the same time, you don't want the technology to have penetrated the entire market, because then, of course, you would have concerns about additionality. So we used this concept and the different factors and applied it to several sectors. And on the next slide, you can see the findings from 2 sectors or technologies. We have identified that the household and community-based projects in LDCs have a quite optimal conditions for supplying offsets, as you can see with the spider diagram. So they provide several SD benefits, but also quite aligned with the expected optimal conditions we have identified earlier. The other factor, the other sector that you can see here is combined heat and power. Here you can see that it's not fully optimal for supplying offsets. This is in particular due to lower contributions to sustainable development, but also due to the technology prices and costs. So what are the overall findings lessons learned from the application of this process? In the next slide, you can see what we have maybe takeaway messages. We clearly found that it's really difficult to apply this generic approach at the global level, because really the factors in each jurisdiction will really affect the suitability of mitigation activities and sectors to a large extent. So this was really an important finding, and so what Maria did and the rest of the team, we elaborated a process that really puts in the center the collaboration with the host countries, because we think that this is really key for developing a sectoral baseline and to develop technological roadmaps that allow to identify those mitigation activities that really need support and could go beyond of what policy and actors could achieve. So you would need this in addition to the assessment at the global level. You can see here 4 steps. So you start by identifying the current sectoral baseline with an on-the-ground survey, by identifying the predominant technologies used in the sector. And this helps to identifying also the average carbon intensity. You then develop the technological roadmap, and by determining which mitigation options exist, and also to identify the future policy options. On this basis, you can identify future mitigation options that go beyond the current technological roadmap, and in doing so, you have clarity on how they can benefit from the offset mechanism. And step 4 is, so to say, an iterative process, because you have to update both the sectoral baseline and the technological roadmaps regularly, because some technologies, some activities might go from being inaccessible to accessible due to, of course, advances in technologies, all other circumstances. So with this this is just a brief insight from our work. On the next slide, you see the cover of the final report, which, as Frank said, will be available soon on the website, today's website, where the link of which you can see here. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico. I'll honestly say, please do look and read it, not just because we really try to make it as useful to policymakers. We gave examples, but the whole point was really to think about how would you walk through which sectors really do need cost containment measures, and therefore how do you identify them to truly say that this is unavoidable, versus here are the sectors that truly could benefit from the carbon finance mechanism, and helping policymakers identify that. So you truly can go into even almost a priority list approach with the way we've done it with NDCs, and it's meant to be practical. The other reason I think you should read it is because I spent so many late nights with Nico on this and debating, and honestly, we'd like to think that it was worth it and it was useful. So for my future dementia's sake, at least know it was worth it at some point. So thank you so much. I'm going to take it next to Karsten. Karsten, who's really Wernicke from New Climate Institute, who's played such a seminal role in doing a lot of thought leadership on thinking about not just about carbon credits, but how it plays a big part in demand-side integrity, and thinking about how companies can really dial up climate action. What does that good look like, and how can they finance mitigation that can really help us meet our Paris goals? So another thing to just plug, if you haven't seen it yet, New Climate Institute came out with the Net Zero database, which really rates companies, and I find it a very useful resource to look through in that kind of standardized way. But Karsten, I'm going to let you really talk about how to raise voluntary climate action here.
Thanks for giving me the floor. I'm replacing my colleague Aki, who was unfortunately unavailable at short notice. As part of this event, I said I will give an overview of the current state and future of voluntary corporate climate action. We have seen an increasing amount of ambitious sounding claims from large companies, but also at this COP, still a very active business lobby fighting for the continuation of cheapest possible supply of offsets, and that at least that poses some questions. How does all of this fit together? And we think it doesn't. That's also where my subtitle for this presentation comes from. Basically, we see lots of claims and pledges, very limited transparency. If you're interested in the details, and a big question mark on the integrity of all of this. There's lots of work that's being done in the background from us, but also from other institutions, and in combination, in partnership with other institutions, where we will deliver in the near future also some new assessment of corporate climate action, their announcement, pledges, and claims, and we really aim to go into very much detail. We hope that we can announce the start of a corporate climate pledge monitor in the next months, and it's very motivating, very positive for us that even Antonio Guterres, in his speech on Monday, confirmed that this is needed, and promised a reaction himself. He said that there's a clear deficit of credibility and a surplus of confusion over emission reductions and net zero targets, and we need an expert group to look at that. It seems that we have spoken, but we haven't. Next slide, please. And with my presentation, I will explain a bit better what the situation is and why we start new initiatives here. We put a question mark against the corporate action is on the rise, because we see a continuously growing number of companies that make claims and pledges, but is action really on the rise? Is really something changes? These claims try to exaggerate and try to be better than the previous one, even if all of this doesn't make sense anymore. If you really go deep into the assessment, then the underlying actions are often insufficient, and what's even worse is that they are so intransparent that an assessment is not even possible. Sometimes seems to be on purpose because there is no implementation plan. Sometimes it's for other reasons that organizations are unfortunately not transparent. Very important is that net zero is also on a company level still not understood what exactly it is. It is net zero at a certain date as a milestone. What we really need is to be net negative thereafter, as we know from the Paris Agreement and from the IPCC. It's not the end point. So the job is not done when we are net zero. And net zero is a concept for countries that have a territory where they can ensure they have access to removals. It's not automatically something that can be translated to corporates, although that's what's currently being done. So the net itself is a problem, and the net in corporate target remains mostly undefined, serves as a dangerous loophole. That's what we can see. And although there are also to have a positive attitude here, there are alternative approaches available, alternative claims that foster transparency on the challenges and the transformational contributions that can be made by companies. Next slide. So what matters is mostly the claim that that these corporates make, that they what they claim to do. If we distinguish between two sides, then it's mostly the offsetting approach and the alternatives that are being made available now. And the offsetting, if it's not done correctly, is highly problematic, because it gives the impression that the problem is solved, that there is, if I neutralize or if I call it compensation, that means there is no harm done, there is no negative impact to the climate, which is in most cases just not true. And that gives consumers the impression that consuming a certain service or product is not problematic for the climate, and they increase their consumption, or they switch from one provider to the other just based on non-credible announcements based on offsetting. The climate contribution approach is an alternative that's being offered and being developed by a few organizations, and now also taken on board by quite some organizations and companies. The key difference is that transparency is number one here. The focus is on reducing own emissions, and be transparent on your remaining emissions. Do not hide your remaining emissions in saying I'm net zero. Make transparent what are your remaining emissions, and then take the responsibility that is linked to the fact that you still have remaining emissions. But don't call yourself climate neutral if you are not at real zero emissions. That's what we really need from companies. And on the next slide, I will quickly, just very quickly go through this. The slide shows again what's really needed from globally, but also if you break it down to companies and to certain sectors, then the decarbonization pathway needs to be even steeper than what the orange curve is here. So small energy efficiency increases, incremental changes are absolutely insufficient. We need drastic, very soon, real transformational change. And the next slide goes deeper. So if we compare then what client science tells us what we need to see from corporates as an appropriate contribution and what the reality is, then there is quite a big difference still. What we need is drastic, far-reaching immediate reductions aligned with the sector characteristics, but what we actually monitor is insufficient immediate reductions, a will or a tendency to still continue current business models. The claims made lack real implementation strategies, and they are mostly insufficient with regards to transparency on the most relevant elements where you can apply different tricks to ensure you are climate neutral or net zero, which is the scope of the emissions that your claim covers, the way you purchase renewable electricity, how you use offsets. We have seen good presentations on this topic already. And the actual financial contribution that someone is doing. In consequence, we have a booming voluntary carbon market, although the very essential Paris Agreement safeguards are unaddressed in this market, and that's highly problematic. And on the other side, we really need transparency, that because the challenge ahead of us is the same challenge for all, and we need to be able to learn from each other, not only in the research area, but also the corporates. And the next slide shows what the key problem currently is, that we have an assessment gap. We have all these pledges and announcements, but what we really need is clarity on what are credible claims, what is good action, what is really Paris aligned, and what is just a good marketing strategy. And this assessment gap is closing over time. We have frameworks now available that allow to assess, but these frameworks are also available to corporates to build a much better strategy than what most corporates currently do. We see regulatory and legal scrutiny of potential false claims that is growing, and that's very, very impactful, and that's something that corporates should be aware of, that there's a growing reputational risks if you do not have a good plan, a good implementation strategy that's not aligned with the Paris Agreement, if you make such announcements, because many of that is currently really greenwashing. And the next slide is also to give it a positive spin at the end. There are alternatives available, and some companies take these alternative approaches already. They're replicated, they are developed further, and there's high potential to really make a good contribution to the challenge that we are facing.
Thanks so much, Karsten. I'm going to go to our next. Is that okay? Okay, thank you.
I'm done.
Thanks, Karsten. And actually, I'm really excited because you have laid out a very important point, that a lack of standardization in terms of what exactly does net zero mean, what exactly is a company doing in terms of addressing its own carbon footprint, and how are they financing beyond that. And I will get to the panel on what the Science Based Target Initiative's launch of their net zero standard last week, how does that change the game in terms of that kind of standardization and really doing it. So I'll come to that towards the end. But segueing from what you've already pointed out, which is the Shell Dutch watchdog here, and like just seeing how fossil fuel companies are creating carbon neutral claims and how do we really think about holding them to account on what exactly that they're doing, I'm segueing to Jonathan Crook, who will really explain to us a lot of the research that Carbon Market Watch is doing on this topic.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Could I get the slides up, please? Yeah, so I'm going to focus on the demand side of the voluntary carbon market, so on buyers of carbon credits, and specifically focusing on how the voluntary carbon market should not be used. And I'm taking the example of so-called carbon neutral fossil fuels. So it's been a recent trend, essentially, where cargoes of fossil fuels will be called carbon neutral and branded in that way. It started in 2019 with Shell, claiming 2 cargoes. So there were 3 cargoes total in 2019, followed by 5 in 2020, and 19 cargoes so far to date in 2021. Now, the fossil fuels that are covered by these claims are primarily for liquefied natural gas, LNG, but it also extends to oil and other downstream products like gasoline, diesel, and others. So as Maria indicated, the firms that are making these claims are oil and gas majors, so Total, Shell, BP, Eni, PetroChina, and many more. And so essentially at this point you might be wondering how fossil fuel could be carbon neutral. And if you are listening to the oil and gas majors, essentially if you offset the associated emissions, that's sufficient to call it carbon neutral. So that raises a few questions, of course, and so we decided to look into these in a bit more detail. So we looked at press releases throughout 2021 through mid-September, looking at 17 different claims, as well as 1 claim from 2020. We next analyzed the content of what's actually in these claims, and we checked these against 6 criteria for transparency and environmental integrity. And next, we actually reached out for clarification to all the firms associated with questions. And finally, we published our findings, which just came out last Monday in a report called Net Zero Pipe Dreams, Why Fossil Fuels Cannot Be Carbon Neutral. So as you can probably guess from the title, our conclusion was that these amount to greenwashing. So all of the claims fail key criteria for transparency and environmental integrity. Here I'm just going to look at 4 specific areas. So the first one on whether or not carbon neutrality is respected, this essentially boils down to the carbon mitigation hierarchy, whether or not firms and their products are first doing everything to avoid all emissions possible and reduce all emissions before resorting to other means like purchasing carbon credits. And so all 18 of the claims just buy carbon credits to claim that their product is carbon neutral. Second is on disclosure of the greenhouse gas emission estimate. So this comes back to carbon footprinting. So 16 out of 18 claims don't actually disclose in their claims what their estimate for the greenhouse gas emissions is. Two of them do disclose an estimate, but it's for an average cargo. So that ignores context-specific factors. So for an LNG shipment, what's the efficiency of the liquefaction plant? What are the distances between ports, etc.? So that's an imperfect metric. And also 6 claims don't even account for scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions is when you actually combust, burn the fossil fuel, and that's, you may know, where most emissions are actually released to the atmosphere. So that's about 70% for LNG. So that's really quite shocking. Next, on whether or not the claims actually disclose where they're getting their credits from. So here, 15 out of 18 claims don't actually disclose any details or enough details. So they might say something very broad, like nature-based projects in Southeast Asia. It's not very specific. And 14 of these claims also rely on nature-based credits, which could be viewed as temporary storage. I'm not going to get into a whole discussion about permanence here, but that's problematic because fossil emissions will stay in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years, and trees will not stay forever, of course, so you can't just offset that one-to-one. On the credit prices, so none of the claims actually disclose the price that they're paying for credits. And so the reason why that's important is because the price that they're paying, the average price of credits right now is maybe about $5 or less than $5 US. So essentially it just underscores that it's far less, buying credits is far less than actually reducing their own emissions. So here is a sort of short analysis from our investigation. Just to show you, you can see there's a full table and analysis in our reports. I'm not going to go into detail about specific claims, but essentially, to claim carbon neutrality, most firms will typically just say that they have offset an undisclosed amount of greenhouse gases with an undisclosed number of carbon credits that they purchased from undisclosed projects. So, yeah, if we're talking about transparency, obviously this is not ticking all the boxes. Yeah, so to conclude, I think there are 3 kind of takeaway messages that I'd like to underscore. So first is that we need real climate action immediately now, and no more greenwashing. So we need to have an end to these bogus claims, frankly. Fossil fuels are not carbon neutral, and they can't become so just by purchasing carbon credits that are totally non-transparent. What we need is firms to actually take real action today. I don't know why that's being shown. Could we go back to the last slide, please? Anyway. Here, I can control it from now. That's fine. All right. Yeah, what we need is real action today. So firms actually reducing all emissions in their operations to the maximum extent possible. And this is just a reminder that the voluntary carbon market is a complement to action. It's not a replacement of action. It's not a replacement of corporate responsibility. Second here is that buyers of carbon credits should adopt the contribution claim model. So this is echoing what Karsten was talking about. So essentially firms could still buy credits, but instead they don't claim to have offset or neutralized or reduced their emissions in doing so. Instead, they would focus more on demonstrate maybe the sum of finance they've dispersed to a project, or what are the local impacts of financing X or Y project. So this is a much more transparent and honest way of actually reflecting what the impact of a carbon credit is, purchasing a carbon credit is. And third, this is just a reminder that we can also think beyond the voluntary carbon market to actually scale up climate and conservation finance. So there's many other options out there. You could invest in R&D for hard-to-abate emissions, finance climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction efforts, and support conservation. We do need conservation and climate finance, that's clear. But we don't need fossil fuel firms to claim that they've reduced their offset or neutralized their emissions by buying carbon credits. So I think with that, yeah, that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much. So going with that, and so there's been very critical discussions here, and what's been heartening is last week the launch of the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Net Zero Standard. And this is, if you're unaware of it, this is an independent net zero standard that actually talks about both what a company has to do to address their carbon footprint, and then what we are awaiting, and they've said, is on beyond value chain mitigation. So what I want to ask for the panel here and to those online is just how does that change the name of the game when it comes to voluntary corporate governance? Because this is primarily on the corporate governance side and it's voluntary. How are you welcoming the SBTi net zero standard? What are the things that because it seems to have addressed everything you're asking for when it comes to transparency and being responsible for your own emissions reducing, and then thinking about beyond that. Would that be a fair thing to say, or yeah, Daniele, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think that we have two parallel tracks. One is the convention, how the country has to commit in direction of carbon reduction and carbon neutrality. And the other one is the business sector, because obviously the business go beyond the boundaries of the countries. I think that both are crucial. And in this direction, science-based target initiative is very interesting. It's the idea to transfer the political approach, the political commitment to the business sector. And this is the strength point. The weak point, in my view, is that you need to have a reliable MRV system also for science-based target initiative. Mm-hmm. Because at the moment you are committing some direction, but there is no control in direction of what is the amount of reduction year by year by the companies. Mm-hmm. So in my view, it's in the right direction, but maybe we need to add something more.
I believe they're actually talking about now not just validating targets and validating the reduction plan, but also verifying, because you have to then disclose each year what your emissions profile is. How well are you going to that? I'm going to take it to then Jonathan. What do you think? Is SBTi net zero standard a game changer?
I think it's an important step forward in the sense that it's clearly underlining that we need firms need to have a clear strategy and trajectory for how to reduce their own emissions that's clearly delineated. So I think in their net zero standard, they say that a firm, for instance, with regard to carbon credits, must reduce 90 to 95% of their emissions before resorting to things like financing emissions reductions elsewhere, or removals actually.
Once they hit the net zero target here.
Once they hit the net zero target. So again, here it's a question of, like as you're saying, timing, right? So it's not buying credits now and claiming that you've hit the target. It's doing everything you can already to sizably and significantly reduce your own emissions before then considering other options. So in that sense, that's certainly a step forward. And it's because, like as Karsten was saying, if we have 2050 net zero targets, okay, but then there's many things can happen in the intervening years, and there's no accountability if you just make a target for 2050 with no clear target for 2030, 2025, etc.
So they've allowed for that in the net zero standard. You have to have interim targets 5, 10, 15 years to get there, and a clear reduction plan on how you're going to meet it within IDF updates. Yes. I'm going to go to Karsten in terms of that discussion. Do you think net zero standard is a game changer here when it comes to voluntary corporate governance? And what more would you want to see when it comes to beyond value chain mitigation?
Yeah, the new standard definitely goes in the right direction. It's much better than having self-declared corporate claims and targets, and I think it is good because it does not allow the short-term offsetting, as explained already. It also includes alternatives to go beyond the own value chain. It highlights that climate contribution claim approaches are a good way to do it as well, and that use of offsets is not automatically the thing to achieve a net zero status. And I'm pretty sure that a huge share of the self-declared net zero claims would not be accepted as a net zero claim under this new SBTi standard. So that's very good. That's the best and most ambitious standard that we currently have. But I also see gaps where more work definitely needs to be done, and where we also need more clarity. For me, the net itself is still not fully explained. What can be used to achieve the net, the details of neutralization approaches, of permanence. There are lots of questions that are still unaddressed. Although the standard was launched, I think the work needs to continue also after this launch. We are not yet there.
So just to have a point of clarification, do you mean what types of removals would be used and what kinds of safeguards are there to ensure its permanence? Is that your...
Exactly, that's not fully defined yet.
I believe they're coming out in Q1 2022 with the idea of what that would be, but let's wait for that.
But that's important work that still needs to be done.
Absolutely, and I think they're on it on that sense. Nico, in that sense, we're talking about beyond value chain mitigation, looking at what would be some of the things that you would see in terms of enabling greater climate action in that front, considering our work and things like that, but just in terms of this notion of future-proofing offsets, what could be some ways in which the SBTI can actually be used here?
Yeah, I think looking at the SBTI standard, net zero standard, I think one thing that I found really interesting is their move from previous versions of the standard, from talking about compensation of emissions towards beyond value chain. So they opened their concept. So that I think that's definitely a point into the right direction, definitely. However, at the same time, I think there's still some question marks, in particular concerning the claims. So I haven't found any details on the claims in the SBTI standard, besides that you cannot claim to be net zero before achieving net zero, which is quite clear. But I think it will be interesting to see how companies would claim in their way towards net zero, and whether they would, in the end, use claims such as carbon neutrality or climate neutrality, and whether, I think here the standard should provide more clarity. And I think from what I have learned, they are working on this also. I think a second point, maybe also related to that, is the compatibility with non-offset credits, or units, right? So how would they be integrated into the net zero standard?
I think Daniele wants...
Yes, I'd like to add something, because there are also a standard under development at the ISO level, is ISO 14068 on carbon neutrality, but we are still in the initial steps, so probably we need another 1 year and a half at least. But in connection with this point, the idea is to claim the commitment to carbon neutrality when you start the process and you start to reduce your emission, and that you may claim the carbon neutrality only when you achieve the final step. So in some way, you have the possibility, you give the possibility to the company to show their commitment along the way without giving the final claims.
All right. Well, here's something that, I mean, it's interesting because we go into this notion of what are the different types of words here. I'm paraphrasing a question that's given by the audience, but if we were to say that regardless, is it the combination of words, or if you were to say that you have transparent footprinting, so it's very clear what your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions is, you actually can show a reduction plan that's actually implemented. So over time, you have to publicly disclose you are reducing your emissions, you are implementing your roadmap, and that is also then validate. And then you also disclose all the ways in which you're financing reductions or financing mitigation beyond your value chain. And you're very clear, as Jonathan has shown, all the different things that you would have to disclose for that. Would that be, if you were to strip it back from the words, but these are the principles, and then from those principles you then put that combination of words, is that good? Does that show the transparency? Does that show the accountability to your own carbon footprint? Does that show ambition?
Maybe a third word is missing, is monitoring. Mm-hmm. Because is the way that you have to control that the plan established is really followed. Mm-hmm.
I mean, exactly. So if you were to have an independent standard, which both validated and then verified, could we say that's good enough?
Yeah.
Would it be good enough? Anyone else saying there needs to be more? Yeah, Frank?
Yes, I just want to highlight, it's not just about a standard, because when you use a standard, you use it for offsetting. But what's more important is to have the first step and the second step beforehand. So what the standard just can elaborate is on the last step. And of course, if you have a good standard, or if you have a good provider for this, then the provider can ask you what you have done beforehand to achieve this target, but not if you are just starting with the last step at all.
Yeah. So sorry, I should clarify. Carbon standards is normally the when we say standards, we normally mean carbon standard, but what I'm referring to is the SBTi net zero standard, which is not just the offset part. It is exactly what you said in terms of the first part of that mitigation hierarchy and making it clear. Yeah, Jonathan?
Yeah, I would also just add that I think that there needs to be some also regulation as well, because otherwise it's voluntary essentially. So I mean, the SBTi, it's a good step forward for sure, but not everyone, it's not required to sign up to the SBTi. I mean, oil companies can keep on buying offsets and calling their products carbon neutral. So I think there needs to be regulation and perhaps regulating actually the claims, so that could be advertising, basically just stopping greenwashing. The EU is considering greenwashing legislation at the moment to sort of try to stop this sort of thing before it happens. And I think that regulation is key, because otherwise it's just voluntary and it's up to whoever wants to do it. And that's not enough, frankly, in my opinion.
No, that's a very good point. And so I was going to say, so 6 countries have come from their consumer and market authorities have come out with environmental guidance. One of the countries, France, has very clear legislation in place on what should be in the claim, what should be disclosed. And if you are going to claim carbon neutrality, it has to go with what we've discussed here in terms of what good looks like. And very interestingly, that legislation also says fossil fuel companies cannot advertise, period. Do you see that kind of movement going across countries and a consideration of that in that way, that they will look at France's example in terms of then, even if it's voluntary, still requiring a regulation of claims to that level of being legislated? And can be for anyone here. Yeah? Any movements in that? Yeah.
Yes, for sure the initiative of France is very interesting, because there's a clear path, clear indication. In Italy, we have only few examples, but some of this one is interesting, because the authority for the fair competition, let me say, issue a penalty fee to any 5 million euro for the claim of green diesel. So it was an interesting initiative, but it's only some single spot. And the idea of France is to give clarity on how to approach this particular condition.
Yeah,
yes.
Frank?
Just to add to this, it's very important to see that we do have some regulation on the ground. When you look, for example, in Germany, the consumer advice centers, they carefully look to the claim of climate neutrality, and in some cases, as what you have indicated with this green diesel, they objected to this climate neutrality because it's not based on real ground. So that is also one aspect that could be moved forward.
That's great. So I think I'm actually going to start the wrap up here. I'm going to do a quick 30 seconds. If you'd be one thing coming out of COP this year, what would be the thing that you'd like to see in terms of amping up corporate action and responsibility? Frank?
Okay. I would like to have also a corresponding adjustment for the voluntary market, so to make it more integer.
All right. Daniele?
Try to connect more the voluntary market with the legislative framework.
All right. Jonathan?
I think I'd echo those 2 points, but I would also say that if we have an Article 6 deal that's finalized, that it be an extremely robust Article 6 deal with no double counting, strong measures for OMGE, overall mitigation of global emissions, human rights included, share of proceeds for adaptation. That would be positive. Yeah.
All right. And Karsten, your 30 seconds? Okay.
Yeah, I would like to see that Article 6 or other mechanisms are really targeting then the high-hanging fruit technologies, technologies that are really inaccessible, and that we all have a good and the same understanding of what exactly these technologies are and what they are not.
All right, that's a nice segue to Nico. Nico, what's your hope?
Well, difficult after so many wish lists. I think I will echo what colleagues have said, and in particular, I think having a robust Article 6 outcome will be key for corporates and also for the voluntary carbon market.
All right, guys, you've heard from the experts what we were hoping for coming out. Regardless of what happens, I'm just going to step back. We're really focusing on climate, but today's actually something great for our Indian colleagues out there. It's Happy Diwali, it's a new year. So with that notion of new year and goodwill, we really want to push this to everyone, including international climate negotiators, to get it done. And second, also tomorrow is happy bonfire night, so you're going to see a lot of fireworks going now. If you want to see truly how the UK has a good sense of humor, it's about celebrating a guy who tried to blow up Parliament many years ago. So with that in mind, let's hope it doesn't come to that here, and let's hope we actually really wish everyone here. Thank you for joining us, having a great discussion, and really raising the climate zeitgeist. Take care, guys.